All right, so I got a bunch of different Israel updates here that I want to get to with you guys. Just going to go ahead and jump into it because I have like 4 different topics that I want to talk about. So we're going to start here with the latest update on the Houthis. Reminder that obviously a couple of days ago, Joe Biden decided to launch a pretty massive offensive in Yemen to try to target the Houthis and try to, I guess, remove their capabilities from being able to continue with their attacks on shipping vessels in the Red Sea. And also remember that the entire reason openly stated by the Houthis, whether or not you like the Houthis, I'm not a fan of them, obviously, but regardless of what you think of the group itself, the reason they are doing these attacks on the Red Sea and blocking ships from going through this passageway that goes right by their coast is because of Israel's offensive into Gaza and the genocidal nature of it. So the simple answer to stop the attacks on shipping vessels in the Red Sea is to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which is something that should be happening anyways, that should have happened a long time ago, but instead of actually putting mild pressure or any pressure on Israel in any capacity whatsoever, Joe Biden is choosing to escalate the conflict and to try to get us further and further entrenched in a battle with the Houthis, which, just as a reminder, the Saudis tried this, okay? For like 9 years they tried this, and all it produced was not the removal of the Houthis from power. It produced one of the world's worst humanitarian crises in recent memory, okay? So we already tried, that was with US backing at the time, to remove the Houthis from power. So then, like, what exactly is the strategy here other than just escalating? And so we've gotten a couple different updates on this. Navy SEALs lost at sea were searching for Yemen-bound weapons shipment. So they say they're lost at sea. I think it's pretty fair to assume what that means in terms of their fate. I find it hard to believe that they're going to be like found in the middle of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden or wherever. So this was a recent update, meaning U.S. troops are now being killed as a result of Joe Biden's strategy in handling the Houthis. We also had this from the Wall Street Journal. Houthis turn their sights now on U.S. ships, vow to keep attacking the Red Sea targets. So the bombing of Yemen didn't do anything at all to diminish their capacity to do these attacks. And not only that, but now the attacks are escalating to not just targeting Israeli ships, right? Ships that are bound for Israeli ports, but now US ships directly, right? And presumably UK ships as well, and whatever other countries were involved in this sort of coalition we put together to go attack the Houthis, right? So all that this did was not calm the Red Sea. It did not, eliminate the Houthis' capacity to do these attacks. If anything, it just worsened the situation. So even if your main focus, as it seems Joe Biden's is not on innocent Palestinians dying in Gaza, but rather protecting shipping lanes and international commerce, even if that's your goal, this strategy of bombing the Houthis made that situation worse. It's creating a more unstable environment so that ships will even more so not want to travel via the Red Sea. So even if you agree with Joe Biden's priorities here, which I don't think that you should, but even if you do, it's not working in that capacity either. Of course, a tangential outcome of this is you've had increased inflation, increased prices because ships are having to take longer routes, which makes it more expensive to deliver goods. You've also had oil prices that are now on the rise in the US and UK as strikes over the Red Sea attacks. So, I mean, just complete failure at any level that you want to look at this, right? We also have this, okay? Moving on from the Houthis there, of course, I think it was predictably an abject failure, isn't going to get us anywhere. People have memory hold the, 9-year war on the Houthis that the US backed Saudi Arabia to go do. That was a complete failure at any sense you want to look at it. So that was obviously a disaster and will continue probably spiraling into a worse situation. And so now we move on to this, some of the latest statements here from the government of Israel. I mean, this is directly from the Prime Minister's account. Right, Benjamin Netanyahu, we will restore security to both the south and the north. Nobody will stop us, not the Hague. Not the Hague, not the axis of evil, and not anybody else. So I wish that there was some tipping point where people, Israelis or people who support the actions of the IDF and the Israeli government under Netanyahu would wake up and have that moment where they're like, hang on a second, are we the baddies? Because when you're going out and tweeting, the Hague is not going to stop us, that's as villainous of a statement as you could possibly get, right? And obviously this ties in to the ongoing ICJ case that Israel is facing right now. I'll give you guys more updates on that in the coming days, but I mean, just screaming the quiet part out loud here, right? This was an even worse statement, honestly. So this was from somebody who is a representative of COGAT. Now, COGAT is largely responsible for facilitating the humanitarian aid, where not even remotely close to enough of it that's supposed to get into Gaza, right? And this was also an organization that I believe had a serious influence on Israel's defense of the lack of humanitarian aid in Gaza, okay, during their ICJ defense at the trial, right? And she said this: there is no hunger in Gaza. No hunger in Gaza. Everybody's just making it up. It's a figment of everybody's imagination. The UN is wrong. Every reputable human rights organization is wrong. Every Palestinian on the ground in Gaza, they're lying. They're all wrong. Everybody's wrong except for the IDF, apparently, right? No hunger in Gaza. Fucking delusional. There were stockpiles of food. Don't forget that this is an Arab Gazan population whose DNA is to hoard, certainly when it comes to food. Just straight up Nazi shit here. Their DNA is to hoard food. This is a person who is largely representative of an organization that is supposed to be facilitating aid into Gaza. And then we wonder, okay, as Joe Biden continues pretending, oh, behind the scenes, I'm pressing to get so much more aid into Gaza, right? We need to look after civilians in a more careful way. And I'm being influential in the Netanyahu government's policy. I mean, this is what they're openly saying. Their DNA is to hoard. It doesn't get more disgusting than that. I mean, I hope that this statement is actually brought up, if it's even possible at this point, in the ICJ case. Because the idea that, like, oh, they're doing everything they can to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza, they don't even think that there's a need for humanitarian aid into Gaza. They see Palestinians as subhuman. How could you possibly interpret it any other way when they're saying, oh, they're Arabs, their DNA is to hoard food? What the fuck, man? And this comes as, like, UN reports are saying that, 500,000 to 1 million people are at catastrophic risk of starvation over the next year if things continue on the current trajectory, right? Catastrophic spread of disease as well. And this is what their representatives are saying. This was made in a statement to Haaretz, an Israeli outlet. So they're not even really hiding it. We also had here from the Biden administration. He put out a statement 100 days into the war, right? As I mentioned in my last video. And he gives this 100-day statement, and essentially nowhere in the entire statement that he put out does he even mention the thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children who have been killed. He doesn't mention the bombing of hospitals and refugee camps and UN shelters and houses where a majority of these structures in the north of Gaza are destroyed at this point. Okay, 2 million people internally displaced. The disease, the hunger, he doesn't mention any of that. The targeting of the journalists, none of that, right? This is supposedly the beacon of freedom and democracy around the world, right? The world's police. And the president of the United States barely even gives a whiff of a mention to Palestinian existence or Palestinian humanity 100 days into his support and arming of this genocidal campaign inside of Gaza. He does mention, of course, the Israeli hostages, right? So he focuses his entire statement, it's unacceptable, the hostages have been subjected to this, right? Which I agree, the hostages should be returned. But what's the best way to get the hostages returned? If only we had had some sort of a temporary, ceasefire that was put in place where there was an example set in terms of how you can get hostages returned. I mean, this literally happened where you had dozens of Israeli hostages and hostages from other countries around the world who were released by Hamas from Gaza when there was a temporary pause in the fighting. So we have proven evidence that is something that can happen. And Netanyahu, the rest of his administration, and Joe Biden, who are vehemently against a ceasefire, are pretending as if they care about saving the lives of these hostages. No, if you want all of the hostages back, step 1, ceasefire. Step 2, do a hostage swap. Because guess what? Israel has been rounding up hundreds of Palestinians in the meantime, most of which are never charged with a crime, a huge chunk of which are literal children. You can do a hostage swap and get all of the hostages returned. I mean, as time goes on, and we just had a recent story that I haven't had too much of a chance to fact check and go through, of more Israeli hostages that are allegedly killed by airstrikes from the IDF, right? 2 more hostages were killed. 3 other hostages were directly shot by the IDF as they were waving white flags and screaming in Hebrew, right? So Israel at this point, on the current trajectory, is far more likely to kill their own hostages than to save their own hostages, right? So don't listen to any, fake outrage or care that they pretend to have about the Israeli hostages. It is utter bullshit when you understand what their policy directive currently is. We also have this. Biden hasn't spoken to Netanyahu in the 20 days since a tense December 23rd call, which frustrated Biden and ended with the words, "This conversation is over. It's over, but I'm going to keep sending you guys weapons," right? Don't worry about it. I mean, again, even this headline here, Biden is frustrated and running out of patience with Netanyahu as the war hits 100 days. He's running out of patience. First off, how much fucking patience do you have? How much death and destruction can you withstand as a human being who supposedly has a moral compass? How much patience can you have for somebody like Benjamin Netanyahu, a far-right genocidal ghoul inside of Israel? But also, the other point of analysis here is, why is this article coming out in the first place? Well, it's because either members of the Biden administration or Biden himself, they're trying to leak to the press that he's frustrated, to give this sense of like, oh, well, he actually doesn't really agree with Netanyahu and he really wishes things were differently, but oh, he's just frustrated, there's nothing he can do, right? Which is such a bullshit premise. Joe Biden, as the president of the United States, the biggest defender, the biggest backer of Israel in the weapons we give them, in the diplomatic cover that we give them on the international stage, he has more leverage than any other human on the face of the planet to end what is happening in Gaza right now. Maybe even more leverage than Netanyahu himself. All it would take is a phone call to Netanyahu and saying, you have to end this right now, or we are going to stop giving you weapons. That's it. How do I know that? Because we have previous examples of basically, if not a lesser form, of that exact kind of conversation happening with previous American presidents, even right-wing freaks like Ronald Reagan. He once got on the phone with the Israeli prime minister when they were bombing Lebanon, and he said, "I'm grossed out. You have to cut this shit out immediately." 20 minutes later, the guy says, "Okay, we're going to pull back," right? That is the kind of leverage and power that Biden has. But he's chosen to go about this in a completely behind-the-scenes way, and, oh, well, maybe if I'm friendly with them and I cozy up to them as much as possible and defend them as much as possible in public, then maybe I'll have more weight and influence with them behind the scenes. That's not how this shit works. Again, we've seen statements similar to this from other Israeli politicians. This is just a reaffirmation of that. Likud member of the Knesset, okay, from Netanyahu's coalition here, Danny Danon, brag about how Israel completely ignored Biden's feeble requests, and then he explains why Biden's requests were backed by zero pressure, right? They didn't agree to a ground invasion. We invaded. They didn't agree to bombing Al-Shifa Hospital. We ignored their request. They wanted a pause without hostages. We didn't accept that. We have no American ultimatum. There is no deadline from the U.S. So this is how they talk amongst themselves in the Israeli media, in the Israeli government, okay? Biden standing out here and pretending as if this behind-the-scenes strategy of pressuring Netanyahu to care more about civilians or to wrap up the bombing campaign or to wrap up the invasion, that is not working. They're openly admitting, we don't feel any pressure. Why? Because Biden's not using any actual levers of power that he has at his disposal to put pressure on them. It's 100% on Joe Biden's shoulders, right? And this is why we've gotten so many leaks from the Biden administration, staff members resigning in absolute disgust, right? I mean, how many people have we seen leaking to the media about how Joe Biden cannot be reined in? Members of his own staff, members of his own administration at this point are saying that Joe Biden is unable to be quenched, right? In what seems to be like a bloodthirsty campaign here. And I don't know, again, how much of it is ideological for him, how much of it he thinks is necessary for, American power projection or something by supporting Israel. I don't know what the cause is, but he is utterly destroying, his own 2024 chances. He is utterly destroying any even remote semblance of respect that the international community had for the United States. He's destroying even the concept of international law at this point by defending Israel as if everything they're doing is fully in accordance with international law, while simultaneously refusing to actually do an internal review as to whether or not they're following international law. He's risking getting us into a broader war in the Middle East with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with Iran. I mean, it's an unmitigated disaster at every single level of analysis you could possibly do. We also had some videos that were coming out of Palestinians who are rushing again to these aid trucks. I mean, look at how many people in this video, thousands of people trying to run towards this aid truck, right? And then remember, circle back to that other previous statement from the Kogat representative. Oh, there's no hunger in Gaza, right? This looks like no hunger, doesn't it? I mean, a couple other examples here to give you a perspective in terms of this not just being isolated to Gaza either, because during attack inside of Gaza since October 7th, they've also significantly ramped up the violence in the West Bank, and that's important as well, right? Rampant arrests that are being made, the rounding up of people, the violence subjected towards Palestinians, killings, murders by settlers in the occupied West Bank. And then we also have videos like this. The Israeli army is conducting a huge invasion of Hebron and Dura cities, shooting indiscriminately at civilian areas. And you can see a little bit of this here with some of the soldiers running around. And then there was an even more egregious video here of, guess what? It's almost like a lot of the accusations are actually confessions, right, from the IDF. Here you have the IDF using a Palestinian man as a human shield during one of these confrontations here. I mean, look at this. Holding the gun over his shoulder, directly using him as a human shield as they advance. I mean, this is what we're supporting. We also had this here in terms of the internal crackdowns inside of Israel. Very authoritarian, despite what people want to claim. Oh, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. Is this what a democracy does? Israel placed in solitary confinement a gray-haired, softly-spoken history and civics teacher for a series of Facebook posts that he made, mourning the civilians killed in Gaza and criticizing the Israeli military and warning against wars of revenge. So did this guy come out and say, I'm going to go arm Hamas? Did he come out and say, I agree with Hamas's actions and their motivations? No, all he said was, I mourn for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. I don't think this war is going to be effective. That's basically all he said. And this teacher gets arrested and thrown in solitary confinement. And that's even probably better treatment than a lot of the Palestinians are getting, because this guy's an Israeli. So imagine the consequences for a Palestinian who even goes on Facebook or whatever and likes a message that, wow, it's tragic that thousands of Palestinian kids are being killed in Gaza, right? That's enough to get you arrested in Israel at this point. So don't tell me that this is a country who believes in democracy and freedom and human rights. It's absolutely absurd. And just to finish off, there was a statement that was made recently here from the former head of Shin Bet. And so this is Israel's secret service, right? So not exactly a left-wing guy here, to say the least. But his analysis is pretty close to my own analysis of all of this, right? Here's what he says. We Israelis will have security only when they, Palestinians, will have hope. This is the equation. To say the same in military language, you cannot deter anyone, a person or a group, if he believes that he has nothing to lose. That's exactly what Hamas is. This is why I say Hamas cannot be defeated through a military campaign. It has to be a political solution to this decades and decades long crisis, okay? It cannot be militaristic in its response, because the only reason Hamas exists, the military wing of Hamas, is because it is a representation of violent resistance to decades of Israeli occupation and apartheid. That's why Hamas is even capable of existing within Gaza, okay? So the idea that like, oh, we just need to go and do this invasion and drop one more bomb and kill one more Hamas member and 10 more Palestinian civilians, and that's going to be, the solution to any of this. No, it's not. If anything, it's only going to make the problem worse, right? And you've seen this in some of the polling data that's come out of Gaza, where support for Hamas has gone up since Israel launched this offensive, since October 7th, right? And that's not because Palestinians 100% agree with the ideology that some Hamas members profess. It's because, again, they are the only people who are actually fighting against the Israeli military, that are actually fighting against occupation, right? And again, you don't have to agree with their tactics. You don't have to agree with killing civilians. I certainly don't. But you have to understand why they exist, why there is support for them, in order to actually get to a long-term solution. And that's what he's saying there. He says Israelis do not accept the concept of a Palestinian identity. We see them as people. That's questionable for a lot of people, but not as a people, a nation. We cannot accept the idea of a Palestinian people, because if we do, it creates a huge obstacle in the concept of the state of Israel. But to him, this mindset and the resulting occupation only brings violence. We shall suffer violence because of the occupation. Occupation will not bring us security. It brought us violence and death, okay? So, I mean, listen, I agree with his take there largely, okay? And so we have all of these updates, right? We have the escalation with the Houthis. That's getting us absolutely nowhere. If anything, it's only making the situation worse. We have updates on the hostages, more hostages allegedly being killed by IDF strikes. No, progress in terms of getting them released. So we have an escalating situation on that front. We also continue to have tit for tat, back and forth with Hezbollah on the north of Israel. Okay, so we have an escalation potential there. And all of this is producing absolutely nothing other than a long-term worse situation, more instability in the region, and of course, more innocent Palestinian men, women, and children being killed.